Hi everyone, Nick LaSalette here, and I honestly kind of can't believe I'm saying this, but this is Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This is the site of the bloodiest battle to be fought ever on the North American continent, as well as arguably the most important battle of the Civil War. Now, before I continue, I just want to say that anything that I say cannot bring justice to what happened here in July 1863. For every detail that I bring up, I'm going to be forgetting about hundreds more details that you yourself should do more research on if you want to. But with all that out of the way, let's go and explore the battlefield.
In May 1863, at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia has yet again defeated another attempt by the Union Army of the Potomac to invade Virginia to take the Confederate capital of Richmond. Lee's confidence is now at an all-time high. He now plans to invade Northern Territory for a second time to hopefully threaten the Union capital at Washington and to force them to capitulate on the Confederates' terms. The decisive engagement will take place from the 1st of July to the 3rd of July, 1863, at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
The first Confederate units to come here at Gettysburg would actually arrive from the north, this way, down the Chambersburg Pike, and that would be General Heath's division. And Heath was conducting what they call a reconnaissance in force with his division. There was rumors that there were shoes in the town of Gettysburg that his men were trying to acquire, and he was under direct orders from General Lee not to bring on a general engagement. But unfortunately for Heath and his men, they would run into the forward elements of the Army of the Potomac. That would be John Buford's cavalry division. This right here is Major General John Buford. His importance in the Battle of Gettysburg cannot be overstated. It was his cavalry division that first encountered the Confederates under General Heath as they came up the Chambersburg Turnpike this way. And it was his steadiness under fire and his quick tactical thinking that bought time for the rest of the Union Army to catch up. And the first elements to reinforce him here would be under John Reynolds' 1st Corps. This is the monument to the 8th Illinois Regiment. Now, as Heath's Confederate division was coming up this way to attack Gettysburg, they ran into Buford's cavalry, like I said, and the 1st regiment to form up to combat those Confederates was going to be the 8th Illinois. And it was around this area where a lieutenant from this regiment would actually fire the first shots of the battle around 7:30 in the morning. And these cavalrymen were armed with repeating carbines, I believe with Spencer repeaters. And so even though they were highly outnumbered by Heath's division, they were able to put up a substantial wall of lead that halted the Confederates in their tracks. This is General John Reynolds of the 1st Corps of the Army of the Potomac. He would arrive on the battlefield with his men at around 10 a.m. to reinforce Buford's cavalry. And it was him that decided that this was good terrain to fight a major battle on, thus committing the Union Army to battle here at Gettysburg. So as the 1st Corps under General John Reynolds arrives that morning on July 1st to reinforce Buford's cavalry, he makes this wooded area here his left flank. In fact, this will be the left flank of the entire Union Army that day for the rest of the day. This is now known as Reynolds Woods. This marks the spot where, unfortunately, he is killed as he is trying to rally his men to move forward to stop the Confederate advance by Heath's division that's coming from this way. As he's riding on his horse, rallying his men, a bullet will enter through the back of his neck and exit through his mouth. Unfortunately, all the men that he's trying to rally will see this, and it'll be very disheartening for them. His replacement that day will be General Abner Doubleday. Behind me here is Abner Doubleday. You might recognize that name as the alleged inventor of baseball, and I'm no authority on anything sports related, so don't quote me on that. But here on the left flank of the 1st Corps, after Reynolds is killed, he replaces him as commander of the 1st Corps, and he performs remarkably well as he fights to try and hold off the Confederate attack down here on the left flank of the 1st Corps. This is the monument to the 6th Wisconsin Regiment of the Iron Brigade. They would be under command of a guy named Rufus Dawes. And Rufus Dawes, in my opinion, would be one of the best regimental commanders of the whole war, a real fighter. And they were tasked with protecting the Union, right flank here. At around 11 a.m., there was a brigade under General Davis that was trying to overlap the Union right flank in a railroad cut that's just behind me. And them, along with the 95th and the 84th New York, charged this way to cut off the Confederates as they tried to overlap the Union right flank here. And I'll take you to that railroad cut right now. So as the Wisconsiners and the New Yorkers came up this way, they formed up here at the edge of this railroad cut. And as you can see, it's super deep. The Confederates didn't realize how deep it was, and they couldn't fire over it to protect themselves. So the Wisconsiners and the New Yorkers came up here, pointed their muskets down into the cut, and there was an exchange between Rufus Dawes and the commander of the Mississippians under Davis here. He said, "Who is the colonel of this regiment?" The Confederate replied, "Who are you?" Rufus Dawes said, "I am the commander of this regiment. Surrender or I will fire." And the Confederates, having no choice, having guns pointed at them, they put down their guns, and all the officers handed their swords over to Rufus Dawes. And Rufus Dawes was left standing there awkwardly with 7 swords in his arms. Between 11:30 and 12:30 that day on July 1st, there would have been a slight lull in the battle as both sides are receiving reinforcements and reorganizing their lines. In this direction over here would have been the right flank of Reynolds' First Corps, then it would be Doubleday's Corps after Reynolds is unfortunately killed. In this area, this would be occupied by the 11th Corps as they come in to reinforce the right flank of the First Corps. And the 11th Corps, just a couple months prior in May during the Battle of Chancellorsville, had suffered greatly after Jackson's flank attack had rolled them up. So they had a lot to prove, and this was going to be a very tough fight for them because coming in this direction, this way, would be Richard Ewell's Corps. So as the 11th Corps arrives on the right flank of the First Corps, this area here becomes the Union center, as the 11th Corps is moving from this area down past Oak Ridge over there. And after that lull period, when General Ewell's Corps arrives, the first Confederate divisions to attack this area would be Rhodes and Early's divisions. And there is a high point for the Union troops in this area. A brigade under a guy named General Braxter is here, and they begin to engage a brigade of North Carolinians that are attacking in this general vicinity. And those North Carolinians will lose around 800 of their 1,300 men that attack in this area, a really high percentage of casualties. So while the 11th Corps is just able to hold in this area, they're going to deal with some problems on their right flank. So as the 11th Corps is forming up on the right flank of the First Corps to complete that semicircle around the western and northern parts of Gettysburg in a defensive line, the division on the extreme right flank of the 11th Corps is under a guy named Francis Barlow. And Francis Barlow comes to this area. This is now known as Barlow's Knoll. And he sees this hill and realizes that this would probably be a better position for him to put his guns. Unfortunately, this is kind of in front of that semicircle, almost making a salient on the right side of the Union line. And at around 3 p.m., after Ewell's Corps in the Confederate Army has arrived on the scene, they notice this salient in the line, and Jubal Early's division attacks this area at around 3 p.m. And unfortunately for Barlow's men, the Confederates will get around their right flank in this area and will begin to roll them up. And this will begin the retreat back southwards towards the town of Gettysburg. So back here on the Union left flank here at Reynolds Woods, that afternoon on July 1st, Lee arrives on the scene at about 2:30 in the afternoon. And after learning about the success that Richard Ewell's division is having attacking the Union right flank where the 11th Corps is, he allows A.P. Hill's Corps here to renew the attack. And he sends in Heath's division once again, as well as a new fresh division under Dorsey Pender. And they begin to attack again up this area at around 2:30 in the afternoon. They suffer a lot of casualties in that assault. In fact, the 26th North Carolina Regiment, they lose about 600 men out of their 839 men. But despite that, they are able to get around the Union left flank and begin to roll that up as well. So at this point, at about 3 p.m., 3:30 p.m., both the left flank here and the right flank are both being rolled up by the Confederates, and the Union Army begins to make a hasty retreat back towards the town of Gettysburg. Despite the courageous efforts of the 1st and the 11th Corps in their attempt to try and stop the Confederate attack towards Gettysburg, by the late afternoon, like I mentioned, both of their flanks have been rolled up and they begin to retreat into the town itself. And the Confederates, sensing victory, will be in pursuit. Thus, the fighting for that day will continue into the town of Gettysburg. As the men of the 1st and the 11th Corps retreated from the north and west of town, they retreated through the streets and conducted what's called a fighting retreat, trying to hold off the Confederate advance as they moved to the south end of town. This is Baltimore Street. This is where a lot of the fighting would have taken place that day. A lot of these buildings were actually there during the battle, so this town does look a lot like it would have during the Battle of Gettysburg in 1863. All right, this is Cemetery Hill. This is on the southern end of the town of Gettysburg. And by the end of the day, on July 1st, as the Union troops were making their fighting retreat through the town this way, they set up their last defensive position here. And Robert E. Lee, realizing the value of the high ground here south of town, sent a command to Richard Ewell to take these heights if practical. And Richard Ewell, realizing that his corps was exhausted from that day's fighting and had suffered plenty of losses themselves, thought that it wasn't very practical to take these heights. Thus, he would bed his men down in the town itself that night, leaving the high ground here and at Culp's Hill behind me in the hands of the Federals. General Winfield Scott Hancock would be riding at the head of the army to help consolidate the position here, while throughout the rest of the night, the rest of the Army of the Potomac would arrive, as well as General Meade himself. Thus, the stage is now set for the next 2 days of combat. This right here is the monument to my boy, Mr. Winfield Scott Hancock. Definitely, in my opinion, the best corps commander in the entire Union Army during the Civil War. His leadership here at Gettysburg will be absolutely invaluable. He will inspire courage and bravery in his men by being so steady under fire and so clear-headed. He will unfortunately be wounded during Pickett's charge on July 3rd with a shot through the groin, but he will recover and will go on to lead the 2nd Corps in many, many more battles. There was no corps commander that was more highly spoken of than Mr. Winfield Scott Hancock. This is General Oliver Otis Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, and he definitely had his work cut out for him on July 1st, but through everything, he did perform pretty well and was pretty steady under fire. And this monument rests on top of Cemetery Hill, where he and his men were able to retreat after the bloody first day's fighting and set up their defensive position. And if you look here, you could see why General Ewell didn't seem very
enthusiastic about wanting to attack this high ground at the end of July 1st. Pretty daunting position. So when all was said and done, the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, had ended in a Confederate victory. They had occupied the town. However, the Federal Army, the Army of the Potomac, had arrived in force and began to entrench on the high ground just south of town. And it was going to take a couple more days of bloody fighting to conclude this great battle. On that afternoon of July 1st, 1862,